Hi there, welcome to Somewhat Overfitting, the podcast about data science and digital transformation. My name is Jonas, and every week I'm interviewing people in the data science field on how they use data in their day-to-day business life. Today I'm talking to Thomas Gubbay, data analyst at Deloitte in Salt Lake City. Thomas was born in France, grew up in Spain, and did his bachelor's in finance in Italy. At one point he lived in Dubai, and last year he graduated with a Master's of Science in Business Analytics from the University of Utah. He speaks 7 languages, one of them being Japanese, but more on that when we start talking. Now about today's show. As I mentioned, Thomas is a data analyst at Deloitte. There he is working mainly on risk and financial advisory projects. In today's show, we talked about how his team at Deloitte is set up and how their workflow goes. Thomas also described the outcome his team is generating for their clients. And finally, we discussed how Deloitte is embracing the use of data with their clients and how they are measuring the value that their projects are generating. So, let's get started. All right. Hi, Thomas. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Pretty well. First of all, you speak like 6 languages, 8 languages, increasing every week?
I'm working on my 7th, but right now I'm just on 6.
Just in quotation marks on 6. On one side, it's like English, obviously. I think French as well, Italian.
So English, French, and Spanish were my mother tongue. So that's what I grew up speaking. And then I learned Italian, Japanese, and Portuguese.
Japanese, that's like respect.
That one was hard.
All right. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So after I graduated high school, pretty much a lot of members of my family were in finance. 2 brothers working in investment banking at the time. So I thought, hey, I'll study finance for my bachelor's. After working for about a year and taking some time off to do some volunteer service that I wanted to do in Japan, I realized that I probably didn't want to go back to finance, and I kind of looked for common elements that I had always enjoyed, which were kind of problem solving, applying, math in terms of like algebra, calculus, statistics, and that kind of led me down the data science or data analytics rabbit hole. And I went to the University of Utah. And I graduated from Master's in Business Analytics. And I was fortunate to get a job offer with Deloitte to be a consultant in their risk and financial advisory practice. So that's where I've been for the last 9 months.
And in the risk and financial department, you use probably data in some way. And what is your job right now? What is your job looks like?
You see it a lot in consulting, but Deloitte specifically, they put a lot of emphasis on data-driven decision-making and leveraging new technologies and things like that. And so whenever they approach a problem, right, and they offer a solution, a deliverable to the client, it's very much data-driven. So risk and financial advisory has many different branches. They go from cybersecurity to IT system audits. The practice that I'm in is called risk intelligence. And that is also pretty non-descriptive, but specifically it's helping these large corporations mostly, right, to deal with third-party risk and to quantify it, manage it, predict it, overcome it. And so it looks very different. I'm on several different projects at a given time, and they all have different purposes. Specifically for me, and I think because of the background that I have, a lot of the time I'll be brought onto a project to see if there's a use case for artificial intelligence. Whenever there's like transactional data, large volumes of data, or there's a predictive component, things like that. But even without that being included, tying financial statements, supply chain forecasts, that kind of thing is very much data-driven.
So you're working on projects probably for different companies, for different customers of Deloitte. And sometimes there's like an outcome like a dashboard, I guess. And sometimes there's like more intense things like machine learning algorithms. Can you describe that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's whatever the use case, the problem is always different.
Mhm.
And so there's several different steps. We analyze what data we have, what the problem is at hand, and what solution we want to bring,
Mhm.
right? So, for example, one project can be detecting fraud
Mhm.
in transactions, or another project can be creating a new forecast system for a supply chain management team. And in those cases, what we try to do is use the tool that makes sense for the problem.
Mhm.
Um, so in this fraud detection case, for example, specifically, and that's where the interesting part happens, where data and business come together,
Mhm.
where we analyze the data, we look at it, we identify it, and then we try to apply the modeling perspective that makes sense. And not just from a statistical or mathematical point of view, but you have to take into account the budget. You have to take into account, the deliverable. Like you said, are we going to
Mhm.
deliver a dashboard? Are we going to deliver just a dollar value?
Mhm.
Are we going to be training the team to do it themselves? So on a day-to-day basis, the approach changes. And I think the biggest strength that a data analyst can have, or even a business person that likes to leverage data, I think, is to be able to have all these different tools available and identify which one really makes sense.
Yeah.
And so if you're a business person, identifying what are your data limitations, right? Statistically, what makes sense. And then if you're kind of more on the analytics side, trying to pinpoint, well, hey, what limitations do I have on the business side, or what strengths are on the business side, right? Well, fraud detection, if there's only 300, 400 transactions, a machine learning algorithm is probably not going to do you much good.
Yeah.
So on a day-to-day basis, those are the kind of the approaches that we have. And a
Mhm.
lot of the time, what we do like to do is give a visual deliverable, because that's really powerful. So I don't know if that really answers your question very much.
It does. So when the deliverable is a machine learning algorithm, is part of your job to model it?
Yeah. So, and I don't want to give myself too much credit. Usually there's going to be a manager that knows a lot more about it than I do. But yeah, it'll be a lot of data scrubbing, gathering the data, putting in a format that's usable. And once you've determined that a artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithm makes sense, then it's about picking which one makes the most sense.
Yeah.
And then we'll go through a lot of back and forth iterations of tuning, training, testing, and then you can't just give a client code, right? Unless they have someone on the team that's like, so that's where the dashboard element, or a presentation, or that keeping that deliverable in mind to someone that doesn't really understand the modeling part of it, right? But yeah, that does definitely happen.
So is it then that the whole team, let's say 5 people, if that's the team size, work on the same algorithm? Or is it more that you have the problem, you have the data gathered together, and then each person is looking into a different algorithm and everyone tests one algorithm, and then at the end you compare the results?
That's a really good question. So I've typically worked in smaller teams where we didn't have a lot of people. I was mostly managing the code, and then we had input, but not necessarily hands-on input. I will say a lot of the work actually comes in the planning phase, in identifying the strengths and weaknesses of certain models, and using, leveraging that experience that your senior consultant, manager, partner will have, saying, okay, this one makes sense, this one doesn't make sense. You'll come to a point where you'll probably end up deciding on just one, right?
In the planning phase already.
In the planning phase, yeah. Or maybe you'll narrow it down to a couple, or a lot of the time you'll have an ensemble model, which kind of takes into account different models and puts them together for a more efficient outcome. But But a lot of the work that actually happens is in the planning phase.
Yeah. And can you describe the workflow? You get the briefing from the customer. You are in the planning phase. You figure out which kind of model makes sense. How does it work after that?
That's a great question. So each there's an element that's very interesting is client interaction. It is very important. Each client will have a different pace. Each client will have a different level of sophistication and different bandwidth, right? They'll be able to support you to a certain extent or not. So taking that into account in the workflow, the dynamic is important. A lot of the time you will receive, so there'll be an initial conversation where you say, this is the problem that we have. These are the data points, and there'll be a lot of, on our part, Deloitte part, asking a lot of questions. We want to understand as much as possible. And then, of course, before you say, hey, yeah, I can do this, or yeah, I can, and then we receive an initial data, or we are given credentials or connect an API, whatever you call it. But we'll get the data, and then that's when really we'll try to pull it apart. There's going to be a lot of EDA, a lot of top level analysis, and really understanding what are we working with, what are the anomalies, what are the outliers, what missing data do we have, what data engineering do we have to do.
How much time of the project is allocated to the EDA part? Like roughly a percentage, like 20% or like 50%?
That's a good question. I would say, yeah, a lot, like 50%.
Yeah, crazy. And then like another 20% on like data cleaning. And then like depending on how much time you have in total, obviously it's like a little bit different.
Yeah, you have to allow yourself time for some back and forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, I will say that for sure. Like the EDA, which kind of leads into planning onto how to approach the problem, that takes a long time, right? And that's a problem I think that's very specific to consulting, because you're constantly dealing with data sets that you don't know, constantly dealing with new clients.
And so how does it go on from there? You have the EDA, you know how the data looks like, you have it cleaned and dealt with the NAs, and then you start thinking about which kind of model would make sense, or what kind of output would make sense.
I would say probably the latter.
Yeah.
At that point, something that's very important from a business point of view is periodic touch points with the client. So it's kind of like a sweet spot. You want to come to them with enough insight that the meeting is not useless, right? But you can't really get too far ahead because they might actually give you a piece of information that's crucial.
Yeah.
A good example is we had this forecast model that we were working on, and if we had tried to just create it we were using a RIMA X model, and if we had just gone and tried to plug in like a neural net into that thing, we wouldn't have seen that there are actually very specific events, disruptions in their supply chain that affected our data. So by doing an EDA, we were then able to say, hey, this is what we want to do. What do you think? And then they'll say, yeah, I think that's a good idea. Or actually, I just remembered this and this and that. Okay. So there's kind of the middle step, touch point, and then I think modeling.
Yeah. And then how does it go in the model? It's hard to imagine that 5 people, or depending, you said small teams, is it like 3 people, 5 people on like one project?
Yeah, it's typically, it's the ones I've been on so far, right? I mean, Deloitte's such a big company and there's so many different types of projects, but it's been mostly smaller teams.
What is small? Like the people who actually work on it. How I understand it, then there's like a manager who comes in once in a while and maybe has more projects he takes care of. And then each team that actually works on the project and does the hard work on it.
For sure. That's a good way to describe it.
How many people is that in your team, for example, when you say small?
So to give you an example, right now I'm on a team that has myself, a consultant, then a senior consultant that will also be pretty hands-on in terms of coding, researching, all that kind of stuff. And then you can either have a manager or a senior manager on the team, but not always. And a lot of the time, the manager and senior manager will be on that project,
Yeah.
and then maybe one or two more.
Yeah.
So I would say usually consultant and senior consultant level are the ones that really do hands-on
Yeah.
modeling approach.
Yeah.
And then the manager will come in with that experience, and then offer, insight.
Yeah. So it's basically two always on people, and then like the manager who comes in and checks in and then gives the direction. That's actually really small. And then you have the data cleaned. You have now your model. What's next?
I will say, so right now, and to take a step back, right now we're at a point, right, where I feel like there's two groups in data science or data analytics from what I've seen. There's been so much development in e-commerce and in SaaS industry and things like that, and even just in consumer goods, right, marketing and such, that there's a lot of very bright, very specialized, very capable people. And then the flip side is you have the rest of industries and companies that are stuck in the Excel world, and if you're lucky, maybe Tableau, right? So I will say that, to answer your question, I'm in the latter group, but Deloitte, being who they are, and puts a lot of emphasis on, hey, we want to be the first ones to offer the best product, right?
Yeah.
So if there's a chance for us to do, web scraping and sentiment analysis on internet chatter, we'll do that, right? They have a team that does that. In our case, we're implementing machine learning models to manage third-party risk, and it's usually just been sales reconciliation, things like that. So we're kind of pioneering that in a not very sophisticated audience. So that's where I meant that the visual aspect is very informative to them.
Yeah.
So you're in essence not just delivering a deliverable, but you're also kind of teaching them.
Yeah.
You're educating them, not just because you're delivering a good product, but also because moving on, right? There's just so many more possibilities. So you want to educate them so that, well, for you can deliver more and more in the future, right?
Yeah.
And make more money, of course. So a lot of the time we'll do like interactive, Shiny, or Plotly has a very good Dash package, which is a dashboard, and that'll give that interactive feel where they can play around with it and feel like they're in control.
And so mainly the deliverables you have are mainly like things like a visualization of the risk that they have, rather than a model that they can deploy and then gives the messages, hey, there's a risk.
So usually, for the most part, we try to do a dashboard deliverable or something, something that helps them visualize what we're doing, basically.
Yeah. And then you don't have any models that need to be somehow deployed on their servers because they might not have the capacity or the knowledge of having a live model running.
So they'll typically if they come to us, they typically don't have someone internally that can, update these models or create these dashboards. So that's what we call a managed revenue. They'll just be more kind of like a subscription, right? To a product that we offer.
How big are the companies you work with? Because I imagine Deloitte being one of the top 5 or 3, or how many tops there are for consulting, but it's one of the top companies. So I expect that the rate is quite high. And then I also would guess that a company that affords Deloitte might have their own data science people, but it doesn't seem like that.
Yes, and yes. So they are typically very big clients, right?
Yeah.
We're talking like Fortune 50 companies.
Yeah.
The issue is, like I was saying, there's certain teams and certain departments within those companies that are very technical and very proficient, right? Like, we don't even compare. Like, they have, astrophysicists doing the data science work. We cater more to the other departments that don't necessarily have that level of sophistication, or certain projects, right, where historically it just hasn't been relevant. But now, because they're getting so big and the world is getting so connected, there's new opportunities.
What is in Deloitte's toolkit at your position right now? Like, what do you use? What programs do you use?
That's a good question. So what tools do we use? Personally, for me, I'm a big R fan, but I've seen a trend that a lot of the data scientists at Deloitte use Python, and to be able to collaborate and work in a team effectively, I put a little bit more effort in learning Python and getting better at it. The principles are the same, but they have a lot of proprietary tools, a lot of text analysis, automation tools. They have a lot of money, so they can subscribe to tools that, web scraping.
Yeah.
And then they have proprietary tools that create sentiment analysis from the news, chatter on the Reddit, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. So that's the benefit, right? If you're going into a big company, they have the power to leverage those tools. But for me, on an individual basis, Tableau I've seen is very powerful at creating very slick visualizations very fast, a very short learning curve. I mainly use Python. There are some cool tools. If you want to make a Python PowerPoint, there's something called reveal.js. Really cool. You can take your Python code and render it into a presentation, which is awesome.
Yeah.
There's Dash, which is a dashboard tool that you can code in HTML and CSS. And then I would say also don't underestimate the power of Excel.
Yeah.
Sometimes the answer is using a good pivot table.
The easiest and quickest way.
Yeah, exactly. So I learned that the hard way. I was trying to code so many things in Python, and sometimes, it's actually really easy to just throw it into Excel and back into Python. It's not best practice. I don't recommend it. If you say that to a data scientist, they'll probably crucify you. But
if it's quick,
whatever
if it works.
Yeah, exactly.
Now being in a consulting and then client facing, how do you measure the value of your work, or how do they measure the value that Deloitte generates?
I'll give you a two-part answer.
Yeah.
Of course, the deliverable, right? That's always good. So let's say you're doing a royalty inspection for a big consumer goods company. Your metric is going to be, well, how much did you get in cost recovery, right? You did this inspection on our vendors, and how much money do they owe us? If you're making a forecasting tool, it's, well, how close do we get to the actual values? If you're not adding value, there's a problem, right? So that's of course the main point. You got to add value, and that's when I said, whatever tool adds value, it's got merit. The second point is there's a big element of your nurturing relationships. It doesn't matter how much value you add. If you're a pain to work with, and if the other person doesn't really like you, I guarantee you they'll find a way to get you off the project.
Yeah.
So really it's about being consistent, about being a good communicator, and about just, empathy, and about good people skills and relation skills.
Yeah.
So you want to add value, but you can't ignore everything else.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Thomas. That's it for today.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for a new episode of Somewhat Overfitting. Thanks again to Thomas for being on the show. Today, I found most interesting that the outcome of Thomas's team at Deloitte are dashboards, and also how small his team is. Let me know what you thought about this episode on somewhatoverfitting.com. There you can also find today's show notes. If you have something to say about data science and digital transformation, visit somewhatoverfitting.com/guest and fill out the form. I'm always looking for interesting conversations. The theme song is called Everything You Wanted from Dan Lebowitz. Thanks again for listening, and see ya.